All right, welcome everyone to the Cartographer office hours. Today's April 11th. And well, we're glad that you're here to discuss the ideas that keep making Cartographer great every week. All right, Joshua will help us today. Today, being note taker. Feel free to add yourself to the attendee list, and including your affiliation, so we can catch up later on. All right. Any new faces? Let me see. No, Jacqueline. No, I guess no, not exactly new faces. So welcome all. All right. We'll start reviewing outstanding RFCs, considering some RFCs that have been, let's say, labeled, not exactly labeled, but considered priority RFCs. So we'll start by the add match params selector. Right now, sitting in the in review stage, the RFC process, and
I think the team
so
is
far,
proposing here that we actually reject this RFC. We don't think it's necessary. So we just wanted to bring it up and get a feel from everyone else.
any
Yeah,
objection
I
to-
mean, as the author, I'm pretty convinced that we don't need it anymore. So yeah, happy to move this to closed or rejected or whatever.
There were some members of the TOC that had commented on it, and so we wanted to just get their feel for it too before officially rejecting. But if no one has anything to say, we could move it to rejected final comment period.
Yeah, if it's not needed. Scott, I think I saw you had a comment on there. Was there anything from your point of view? I think I saw one comment.
I would probably have to go back and re-spool the context to have a sense. But if the team doesn't think it's necessary, it's fine to close it. If we need it, we can open a new one.
Cool.
Okay. So should we move it to decline?
It's technically final comment period, but
Yeah. Yeah, okay. 1 minute final comment period and then decline. All right. Okay. Okay, cool. Thank you all. Next up was events. The RFC.
So Rash isn't here to talk about any of this, but we brought this up. Does anyone know why we wanted to chat about this today?
I think it was to get more feedback from the TOC since Rash had responded to the initial comments, but it looks like Scott just put some comments up in the last couple of hours.
The main question I had is whether this RFC is proposing that we should have events, and generally these are types of things that we should have events for, or whether this RFC is saying these events as specified will exist. Generally in favor of saying these are the types of things we would like to have covered, and then leave the actual content, especially like the messages, up to the implementation to evolve.
Makes sense.
So that whole table, I don't want to say becomes irrelevant, but like essentially should not be part of the RFC.
It becomes exemplars.
Right. I'd second that.
would it be good? So if we just update basically the summary of the RFC, would that be all that's really
Yeah,
needed?
I mean, in the lead into the table, it says like these are the types of events that could exist, which kind of made me wonder, like, is this actually saying these need to exist, or is it saying like these are possible things to do? So I think clarifying that in the summary is perfect.
One question I have though is, and this just like in general, are events and like specifically the types of events and the reasons, are those part of like a public facing API, or do we consider that kind of like log messages? Because if it is part of the public facing API, like we would want to codify it to an extent and ensure that we don't break that or anything. And then I'd want to see them laid out explicitly in the RFC. But if not, just like log messages, I'm happy to not include the details in an RFC.
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess I can, for my own experience with events, is that typically people don't program against them because they are ephemeral. Like K8s clusters will garbage collect them and drop them pretty quickly. But within that, like once you have an event with a specific reason, like you typically want that to be somewhat stable and not change the meaning of that reason. So it's like, it's not strictly part of the API, but like the reasons are kind of part of the API. And like you don't want to unnecessarily flip flop on what things mean. But if other people have better or more experience with events, that'd be great to know.
I don't have the experience, but I wonder whether or not it's a common practice for like people writing operators to react to events.
In the broader ecosystem of Kubernetes, I'm sure somebody has done that. Typically, I've never seen it. Typically, you basically care about what the status of a resource is, and then you basically make decisions based off of that.
So no one's programming against them, and they probably shouldn't be, but we still want to keep them somewhat stable for the sake of clarity when used, like in readability and usability. If I could sum it up in a word.
I think that's a good summary.
So it doesn't sound like there's too much of an, like, obviously try not to change meanings of things, but like, if there's not that much of a risk, I don't know if it's worth saying that everything needs to be codified in an RFC then. What do others think?
So basically like adding events doesn't require an RFC, but if we ever wanted to remove or change or do anything weird, then that would probably need an RFC.
I don't know if I'd even go that far. If we're going to make an RFC to remove, I think we need an RFC to add, is how I'd formulate it. So either, reasons are RFC'd or they're not, is that what I'd like to say. Right, because like if you need an RFC to remove and not to add, that means, anybody could go add one without an RFC, and then everyone else is stuck supporting that forever until you make an RFC to remove it,
Mm-hmm. So no RFC needed.
So I
Sounds
do
good
think
to
it's
me.
still good to have an RFC that basically kind of talks about the broad concepts of events and the types of operations that we think are appropriate for a cartographer to produce an event for. But in terms of actually defining like an API for events, like that feels like overkill.
Yeah, it would be good to have some guidance so that when we come up with future features, it's easier for us to reason or get the answer to like what events should matter for this new thing that we're building here.
Can this just be like a PR to contributing rather than an RFC, and people can put their thoughts on the PR? Like, I don't know what this RFC means. I mean, like, I'm happy to, like I think there should definitely be guidance in terms of what we're doing, but feels a little weird as it, if we don't consider it part of our API, it feels weird to write an RFC around like what types of things we want to do in general.
Like, I think it's fair for RFCs to define best practices and how Cartographer embraces those established best practices. So like producing events is a good practice for a controller, and this sort of describes how Cartographer approaches that space within its domain. So I think having that as an RFC is not bad. It's certainly not as directly impactful as some of their RFCs, or when they get approved, like there's actual changes that immediately happen to the code base, as opposed to this is saying, this is how we think about a subject.
All right, I'm happy to keep it.
Any other comment around this RFC?
Scott, did you sum up the comments that you wrote within the last couple hours? Did they say something to the effect of what we were just saying, or is it worthwhile for me to go back and sum this up?
One of them was exactly this.
Perfect.
Last thing
The
I'd
one
say is, I
Bob's doing
think,
right now.
last thing I was going to say, I think it's good to try and, yeah, don't want to overkill RFCs. I think everybody works on more on RFCs than anything else. So it'd be good to try and find the balance. And hopefully we can, as we evolve, we can find more that leans into more coding reviews and various other practices, you know, around guidances, as opposed to fully fledged RFCs checking everything that's going in. It doesn't need to be like that. You need to have freedom to be able to work and evolve, and then we have up to higher levels, I suspect.
Okay. So what will be the next step for this RFC? It will be still at the same stage, block on TLC?
We can put it in review, I think. I think it'll be up to Rash as the author to look at the comments and do some editing or respond.
What's the difference
there's
between
no
in
objection.
review and blocked on TOC?
If we're explicitly waiting for like comments from the TOC versus like general everyone from the team.
So like in this case, there's only one approver. So seems like it's still very much in review anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, I think blocked on technical oversight is like a subset of in review.
Right.
Before we go to
Great.
blueprint, can I just, this is probably a question, I don't know, this is for the submitted status one. We have approvals on, I think we have 4 approvals. How long do we give before we just, people are abstaining and we can move this into final comment period? That's the piece I don't understand about the process. Like, can we just move this into accepted and it goes into final comment period? Or what, or final comment period? Then accepted, whatever it is.
Yeah, well, I
don't
would say
think-
so.
I think we need to give an opportunity, right, for people to like accept it. And I think it's a little too quick of a turnaround for something like this to just blanketly assume that people are abstaining.
I guess that's
Maybe
my
this-
question is like, how long do we?
Yeah,
Because I guess it's only been open for a week.
yeah. I don't think we need to wait that long, right? Maybe just like another week or something. And then we can assume that we'll just try and get people on board and if
What,
people still.
Sorry,
Sorry.
Joshua. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go.
I was gonna say, we'll give it one more week and then we can start moving to final comment period next week. How's that sound?
I guess it does seem like do we lose a whole week there, right? It's just and wonder if there's anything we can do to say, I don't know. They've had a week, people have had a week, it's been talked about. You know, there'll be discussions in Slack or in office hours. Like if you haven't said anything now, or even asked a comment, then it's gone past, I don't know, a set number of approved, then we can just move it through. I don't know. Just a thought. It just seems, it's like losing another week. It just seems a very slow process, isn't it?
I'd +1 that, like we have with the author and the 2 approvers from the team, that's almost half the team plus 2 members of the TOC. And like, there's no formal process of like how long it takes to be considered an abstaining. And like it was presented at a meeting last week, talking about it now, had a week to look at it. How long, you know, how come, almost like what is one more week to, like even after that, like, well, it's only been open 2 weeks, maybe we should give them some more time, you know, like.
So I guess
Yeah.
like I would propose that we move this to final comment period and then after like, and if people want to reject this RFC, they have a week to do that, right? So
I think
think
at some
it's-
point the onus is on the maintainers to be aware of the things that they're maintaining, that we are maintaining. So I would agree.
I think that makes sense. The only thing I'm trying to avoid is like someone being on vacation for a week and then they have like legit concerns about something and they never get a chance to voice it, right? So as long as like we can avoid like that simple turnaround where someone like doesn't get to voice their objections, it doesn't feel like this is the case for this one. So I think it's fine.
So the only waiting period that's mentioned in the RFC process doc is a 7-day final comment period, assuming there's contention, right? If people disagree about something, then we say, okay, we'll wait a week and I'll let things shake out a little bit more. But other than that, it seems like everybody should be voting affirmatively, negatively, or explicitly abstain, right? And that if somebody on the maintainer team hasn't voted on that, kind of by my read of these rules, right, they should tell them to get their opinion there. Is it that we want to move to something that's more lazy consensus as opposed to having everybody explicitly indicate? And then if we do want to move to something that's lazy consensus, we should get that in the rules and not move to that before we have figured out what it looks like, right?
We haven't defined what abstaining means, right? Like we don't have an official abstain versus a lazy abstain. We just never defined that, right?
I mean, for now, if you're going to abstain, comment on the RFC with something that says I abstain, so that we know we can move on. Because otherwise, we're gonna have to have the discussion for every RFC about how long we wait for people who haven't made any indication of what their opinion is yet, right?
We've pretty much done that for every RFC we've approved until now, because we've never gotten everyone's opinion expressly written on every RFC so far.
Makes sense. Does anybody object to saying everybody should, for now, until we change rules to lazy consensus, if we want to do that, everybody should explicitly put their opinion on every RFC, either yes, no, or abstain?
For what it's worth, we do call out that we use that model under our governance.
Ah, interesting.
Is that also true for the TOC? Because I feel like we've generally been saying like one approval from the TOC has been sufficient to approve as well.
Yeah, the one approver for the TOC, I feel like that should be at least pretty clear. Like, it doesn't move forward unless, at least somebody has a chance to review it and say, yep, okay with this.
But there, we won't wait for everyone from the TOC to vote, you're saying?
No, absolutely. I think at least that should be clear in that. the document. I don't know if we need to figure this out right now, but
No, it's fine. And we actually call this out, right? We actually say that we require a time period of no less than 5 working days for comment and remain cognizant of blah, blah, holidays and stuff.
So then we can move this into final comment period.
It's always fun to
We got lucky.
find out things about our own process. Yeah, let's do it. Okay, let's stick with 5 days and then plus the final comment period that gives people like upwards of 2 weeks to object if they really want to. So that seems like plenty.
and we should take a note to clarify this in the RFC process doc and or make changes if we feel like it's not working.
Yeah, right. So this RC should be still in review for the 5 days period that you mentioned, Joshua, and then FCP, then and or what?
No, I think the suggestion is that we go directly to FCP this one.
Okay, there you go. Sorry. All right. All right. Okay. Okay, now common blueprint architecture.
Yeah, I think that one I'm gonna present. If I could share screen, it might be a bit easier.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, so this one is still in draft state. Like it's a draft PR because we're still looking for feedback on some options here, and we got a little bit of feedback, but still want to present it to everyone so we could discuss it a bit. But the basic idea is collapsing all the current blueprints which we've used to define supply chains and deliveries. So collapsing all supply chains and deliveries, and now all templates into a single CRD called the cluster blueprint. And so the idea there would be everything, all templates, other than cluster and templates and supply chains would all have a way of defining, of like being selected against and defining resources to stamp out. And I guess to start with like why we want to do this. First of all, there's like 7 CRDs that you need right now to create a simple supply chain or delivery. So simplifying that data model can be helpful for users to not have to learn all the different CRDs and when to use which where. And there have been a lot of steps, a lot of times where we've said it would be nice if we could reconcile templates, but it's always the trade-off of like, well, it would be nice to reconcile them, but there's also 5 new reconcilers we have to add now. So if we could also collapse those into one type of template, that would make it easier for us to reconcile templates and do, you know, more meaningful things with their statuses. This also would be a way of enabling snippets, which we've talked about. And yeah, so there's 2 options for how to do this. Or 2 options that we're presenting. There are, of course, many others, but we're presenting 2 and asking for comments on which one people prefer. And then the idea would be to take this RFC and rewrite it to suggest just the one option that we feel has most consensus. So the first one, I should have reviewed this before I started presenting because I wrote this a while ago, but the first one is basically saying that every blueprint will have an optional selector field because you could either define templates that can be selected against directly or not, and would then only be meant to be used as part of a larger blueprint. And then the blueprint would have this list of resources. And they look exactly the way resources look right now in a supply chain. For the most part, except one, this allows for inlining a resource within this resource, inlining a resource within one entry in this resources array. And then other than that, it's pretty similar, except some names have changed because, you know, templates are now blueprints. Other than that, it's pretty similar, but the difference here, which is true about both options, is that since there's just a cluster blueprint, there's no source or image or config templates. Outputs are whatever you want them to be. So you'd have to name your output and the value and the path at which to grab the value for every blueprint. And so you can name them whatever you want and just define like which resource to look for an output. And so like here we're saying, look at the first resource and grab the output foo. And if you go up to the first resource, since this is a resource which is inlining, it is defining this output foo, which lives at status.url. And the same thing would be true for all of them. Like even if you're not inlining and you're just referencing another blueprint, you would then kind of have to know here that this other one of, you know, these two other blueprints are passing an output called bar. And that's what we're grabbing to put on the output of this larger blueprint called fizz. The main, I think, only difference between this and the second option is the second option does not allow inlining of templates or blueprints within the resources block. And so every blueprint now functions either as a supply chain or as a template in today's world. So either you have resources which reference other blueprints, or you make this blueprint the blueprint that's actually templating out a stamped object. Other than that, the options are the same. But the idea was that, you know, this inlining gets a little bit hard to follow, even though it can be nice and helpful on the smaller scale. Like, you know, in the larger scale, it can create some really hard to read blueprints. And so it might be easier to use if we kind of constrain every blueprint to either act as a supply chain today and define resources, or act as a template today and just define the template or YTT.
So,
And
sorry, question. Is there so is this whole thing written so that outputs are custom, or is there any strong typing still?
none of the options presented, neither of these two options use strong typing. There was a comment made on the PR about that. But the options as they're written do not say anything about strong typing. Steven.
I actually had basically the same question, but I left a kind of a longer form version of that comment just yesterday. I'm not sure if you had a chance to look at it yet. I wonder if it's possible to preserve, like, I really like this idea. First of all, like, you know, I think it's a great way to go. I really like the simplicity it adds and kind of the added flexibility. I like the idea of getting rid of the kind of, maybe call it static types, right? Like having each of the resources for each type, you know, require an explicit CRD, cluster image template, cluster source template. You know, that's always felt very inflexible, right? Like it'd be great if we could maintain that typing, but not have to kind of, you know, maybe directly encode the typing, you know, into the kind of UX we're creating. I wonder if it's possible to, you know, maybe if like right now we have strong static types, right? Maybe we could move to strong dynamic types or something like that, where we still maintain the types. So you can still swap a template that outputs an image for any other template that outputs an image, but we don't have to put the names of the types and the kinds, for example, of the resources. Like, could you have cluster blueprint that, you know, outputs a type, and then maybe there are two CRs. Maybe there's a cluster blueprint type CR where you could use to register types in the system that has an open API, you know, schema for what the type looks like, or something along those lines, right? Like, is there a way we can, you know, make the types something that a distribution of maybe a platform built using Cartographer defines, right? But aren't hard-coded into Cartographer itself, and still maintain that swappability. Maybe make it a little more of a generic tool in that way. It's just an idea. I don't know.
I think that makes sense. And would you propose that type be mandatory? Like, could you not specify a type if you don't care about that swappability? Or would you say everything needs a type like that?
Right now we have like a void type, which means there's no output, but we don't have like, generic box, like generic string type, right? Maybe instead of saying that the types are optional, maybe, if somebody wanted to create a generic string type, right, that's a type they could register specific to their platform that, just would have that meaning, right? Of, no, it's just one value, whatever you want to, put in it. But that way we don't make everybody, who's using the tool have to take that option.
I think the one thing that is possibly worrisome with this approach, that I think that what Stephen is saying may help with is we've seen people using Cartographer where you can separate RBAC between like a supply chain and the actual templates. A lot of times you may want a developer to be able to create what a cluster source template is going to look like, but not be able to touch your supply chains that are managed by a different team. And actually, if we move it to a single CRD, managing the RBAC of a platform like this becomes very difficult because you can't separate concerns that way.
Would you prefer to manage that by having namespace scope blueprints instead of like letting a developer access cluster level resources? Like if there were a namespace scope blueprint, would that solve the problem? Sorry.
I think it could solve the problem. I think that possibly having the two CRDs where one is a blueprint and one is a template, even if we took away the strong typing and just had a template which would be used for source, image, config, cluster template, anything like that, and one for the supply chain, allows also, even staying at the cluster level, the ability to say you can configure things, but in order for it to be targeted by a workload in this cluster, you need a platform admin to be able to adapt that in a supply chain, right? So it's less flexible than today in terms of the RBAC, but still separated.
And sorry, Scott, I'll let you go in a second. Just one final clarification. So when you think about that separation, do you want, because something implied by the proposal is that you can encapsulate kind of a supply chain definition in something that's reusable, right? Is it that is the thing you want to restrict access to the any combination of any kind of coordination of templates together, or is it just the one that selects the descriptors that you want to gate access to? Because in this world, I imagine some of these would have that selector at the top and some wouldn't, right? And the ones that don't are just kind of like templates, but they may actually be a combination of resources, and some would actually have the selector and it would apply to the platform. Is it more that you want to gate supply chain versus template? Yeah, gating the selector. Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Gating the selector so that the platform team could be the ones that say this is selectable in my cluster. This is something that someone else can target now within the cluster, versus this is something that exists that nothing can target unless we, the platform admins, allow it.
Thank you, Scott, so much. Scott Andrews, you had
Stephen
something to
covered
say?
it.
Oh, okay. Who's next? Adam, maybe?
All right.
I have more questions if somebody else
Go
doesn't.
for it.
Yeah,
Go for it.
For your selector at the top, because this kind of, before we had workload and deliverable, right, as different descriptors, it seems like that selector would need a kind also, or like it would need to define the type of descriptor that it applies to. It might be good to just kind of flesh out that section a little bit, because it seems like it's going to be pretty different from what we had before.
That's interesting. I mean, the way supply chains are now, it doesn't explicitly reference workload. It just says like spec dot, and it's knowing that it's looking at some sort of owner. And so you're saying you might want to restrict certain blueprints to only match against a workload versus a deliverable.
Yeah, because right now we have supply chain and delivery as separate, things that can do selection against their respective descriptors, right? But if in this world, if we just have one type there, we'll need to say, what it selects against. And maybe that could be something that the user could bring also. Like because we don't have a contract with the spec of the descriptor that's only in the templates, right? That could be a resource that, actually could be brought from outside of Cartographer, which I think is really interesting too. Let you maintain your own descriptor as a platform author. You could have your own spec fields, make your own conversion webhooks, even if you wanted to migrate it forward. I think that it's a lot of interesting stuff. I think this opens up there, but you would need a kind reference in the selector.
Yeah, I can definitely add that.
Okay, great. Any other comment around this RFC?
Just to double check one. My understanding, on the first option, is that right? So it's mutually exclusive. You can still do the reference to another blueprint name, or do and then have another one that is referencing doing an inline. You could still use both. Yeah, makes sense. Okay, got it.
Yeah, but in this world, even if like any template that was inlined would be under resource. So it'd be like under resources. So you could have like an array of one thing that's all inlined.
And then and the second resource
could reference that other blueprint that just has one resource that's inlined.
Yeah, so yes, it would be a separate cluster blueprint that was got it. Yeah, makes sense.
So I guess I heard kind of one suggestion around strong typing here, and Scott mentioned the concern of like keeping blueprints and templates separate. Do others feel opposed, agree to that? Because like, if that's the way we want to go, we can obviously rework this RFC to have just two CRs, blueprint and template. But I want to see what others think of that.
I wonder if the separation, instead of being blueprint and template, if it's more like instead of pushing selector into blueprint, we should take selector out of blueprint. And the thing to decouple is just, maybe a CR that maps a selector to a blueprint. And then you preserve that, kind of nested reusable nature of the definition. And then the thing that actually acts on the cluster, right, can stay outside of it and have separate RBAC. Because I think that would solve Scott's problem.
It's like a cluster blueprint and a cluster blueprint selector.
Yeah, maybe at the end of this we have cluster blueprint selector, cluster blueprint type or something. And
right.
That's the new. we still have 3 CRs, but they're very different, more abstract things.
Right.
Yeah, I think that would definitely solve it. If the selector was separate, it would still solve that issue of RBAC.
All right. If no one's opposed, we'll rework the RFC with all these comments. And one last question, I guess, the original question. What do people think about allowing inlining within this resources block versus not allowing inlining?
I think a good rule of thumb there is to say one template per resource. When you start to have multiple templates in the same resource, it can get very confusing and overwhelming with knowing like exactly where you are in the context.
So that would be in favor of option two.
I also like option 2. I think just keeping it really flat and preserving that current, way of defining a template that's, sort of straightforward. I also, at some point it feels like you might want your templates to be in a Git repo or not on the cluster, right? And so to me, option 2 might lend itself a little better to that in the long run.
All right, well, thanks for the feedback, everybody.
Just, I did like the inlining, just to really mess it up. But no, I take what Scott and Stephen are saying. I guess where I was coming from, being able to visually understand and get that, and follow something through is quite appealing. And having the indirections sometimes is quite hard to rationalize. We're looking at different resources, but I could imagine these could probably escalate quite badly. People could probably abuse this if it an inline, and could grow to be quite heavy and unmanageable. So I guess we want to encourage folks to go down a nice composable route, which is easier to manage, maintain, and test as well.
Robert, please.
Yeah, a question I had, maybe I missed this. Is the intent for the cluster blueprint to replace the old 7 templates that we're accustomed to now?
Yeah, in the long run, yes.
There's going to be a breaking change at some point, right?
Yeah. Yep. And we could convert things sort of to an extent. But yeah, no, pretty breaking.
I think at some point when it, oh, sorry, go ahead, Robert.
Keep going.
I think at some point it's worth deciding, is this a thing where we're going to make a new API version with a bunch of conversion webhooks, or should we say, we keep the old thing supported for an amount of time, and then here's a separate thing over here, right? Some decisions to make. Seems like we have a bunch of changes like this that we want to wrap up.
Stephen, can I ask what you meant by your comment? Maybe both could work together, inlining and not inlining.
I wonder if there's a design where you could have the template, like the blueprint can be a template at the top level, right? So there's not a lot of, deep nesting, right? But at the same time, when you're specifying that resource list, you have the option of providing a template inline, right? In addition to providing a reference to one, and that way everybody wins. We get the things can be templates at the top level. You can have the resource list, and your resource list can look like a bunch of templates in a row. If you want one really long, if you want to really avoid indirection and have just one supply chain that is everything together in one definition, you could do that, right? Just give folks all the different organizational options they want.
So you've got top level resources or template /YTT. And if you choose resources, you can still inline though. If you choose template or YTT, you can't use resources though.
Right.
Gotcha. All right. Let the people give people what they want.
I don't see a disadvantage to it.
Okay. Well, thanks for all the very in-depth feedback, everybody. This has been really helpful, and hopefully we'll have something new for you next week or soon after that.
Oh, all right. Moving quickly to what will be next, RFC, the one that's still blocking TOC. Simplify runnable usage. Wishua is not here, but was wondering if there are comments, especially from TOC members around this RFC.
I think maybe I'll go first. Or no, sorry, James, go ahead.
No, go for it, Stephen.
So this RFC 705 and another RFC, I think it's 787, are kind of related, and there are ways to simplify runnable, right? I think it's possible to play this one, kind of separate from the other one, right? Where you'd create a new reconciler for in order to reconcile one of the cluster templates into a cluster run template and a runnable. Like there's an architecture that could work, with an extra reconciler to make this one work. I think there's a lot of reluctance around doing this before 787 if we're going to do 787, just so we don't, kind of create one architecture over here to solve this one problem and then have to, replace a lot of functionality, get rid of a reconciler later once we have the ability to inline cluster run template into the runnable, so we don't need to kind of reconcile out that resource, right? And so instead of playing this and then rewinding some of it and then playing the next one, especially if we're going to batch a bunch of breaking changes up into an API version release, it might make sense to look at 787 first and see what's possible there. Some interesting things about 787 and kind of a reason, something that makes me feel like this can be a bunch of changes wrapped together. In 787, I think the big difficult thing to get past to make this work is the multiple layers of templating, which is just due to the selector. So Runnable has this idea of selector that basically selects another descriptor. And somehow that feature ended up in Runnable, because I think it let it be used in a kind of self-contained way to select against a Tecton pipeline to be used with a Tecton pipeline run. But it may be that selector it's kind of similar to the top level descriptor, and so I wonder if that in the long run could turn into secondary descriptors that don't trigger the creation of instantiation of the blueprint, but let you reference additional resources, and then you could pull that out of Runnable. Then it would be possible to inline run template. Then it would be possible to, it'd be easier to create that shortcut, right? And so there's kind of a bunch of changes here that are interconnected that I wonder, if a larger architecture, might encompass. Does that make sense? I'm kind of this is a little bit of a rabbit hole there. I guess Washum is not here and was kind of taking this one.
Thank you, Stephen. Any other comment around this?
Sorry, I'm just trying to take notes furiously, but also have a quick question. When you say a more generic approach to selecting other objects in the cluster, right? How, is that by allowing other objects to be selected against a supply chain, with a supply chain or blueprint or whatever we want to call it? Or is that allowing objects to be selected with a workload? How do you envision that generic other selector working in place of Runnable?
So instead of allowing Runnable to select another resource and templatize that into the cluster run template, right? Which is, it seems like it's a little maybe out of scope of what Runnable would normally do, right? Like Runnable's job is stamp out resources and then garbage collect them, right? Its ability to just say, oh, and by the way, I'm gonna look for some other resource and also templatize that into the run template, especially just one other resource, seems really, it's a little purpose built for one specific use case. I wonder if taking that selector functionality and moving it up to the supply chain level, right, the blueprint level, right, and then allowing that to be templated at the top level, in the cluster template instead of the cluster run template, right, would just the same way we do with workload, right? So it'd be the only difference between it and workload, between extending it to you can have n number of descriptors instead of one, is that these creation of these other descriptors doesn't create an instantiation of the whole thing, right? They're just used alongside a workload, right? I wonder if pushing that up into that kind of blueprint level would make Runnable simpler and its purpose a little more well-defined, and kind of stop us from needing to manage templating on top of another templating, which is why we can't inline it today, or why the barrier to inlining it that we've identified today.
And then these other objects that got selected alongside your workload would just get injected into every single template along the way?
Sure, or there could be a way of managing what mapping of descriptor to a template, but that doesn't seem unreasonable to me.
Interesting. Cool.
So one way of I was thinking about this just as you were talking, and maybe this is right, maybe this is off. But if we took the notion of params that currently exist and basically said, instead of defining them statically, either as part of the template or as part of the supply chain, we could take it and make the param sort of have another way of defining the default value, where you're basically saying, go actively look for some other context in the cluster and then use that as the value that gets injected. I don't know if that's the same as what you were proposing, Stephen, or whether that's just a wacky off the wall idea.
All right, I missed the last part. Can you can you repeat it again?
So basically just using take the existing param infrastructure, so that what allows us to pass individual key value pairs from the supply chain to a template. And basically, instead of taking the existing default value, that's currently just like you have to define the value statically, having that provide some selector to be able to go grab some other state from within the cluster and pull it out.
That's interesting. So instead of tying it to explicit descriptors, right, make it a little more specific to the, like a supply chain can use parameterization,
yeah,
and then the supply chain defines that contract.
It would be a generic way of looking up reference data.
I mean, the supply chain or in the
Yeah.
template though.
So param values.
I mean, right now you can supply a value in here, but
I guess logically it would be both,
right.
depending on where you wanted to look up and inject the value. Because I think you can provide defaults at both levels right now.
Yeah, you can.
I think we need some way of saying that the descriptors are co-labeled, right? Or something like that. That there's, because it's not that you want to grab every tecton pipeline in the namespace that's next to the workload. It's that you want to grab the tecton pipeline that has, you know, the workload name in its as a label on it or something like that, right?
You would have to define what resource to go fetch, as well as a selector or name, and then also a adjacent path within that to actually get the value you care about. So it'd be not the simplest thing to define, but it would be possible.
I like that too. That might be better than, because the weird thing about saying there are multiple descriptors is they don't all, the first one is very special, right? Because it triggers the instantiation of everything. So that might be
The other
better.
problem with that is that it would be defined, like most of the logic happens on the supply chain level rather than the template level where you're actually using it, right?
Actually, I think that's a key advantage of this, is that it gives you a way to parameterize supply chains that without having to actually specify all the parameters on the workload. So you could have like a resource in that namespace that's configuration for supply chain without having to sort of specify that config on every single workload.
I'd really like that.
That's probably a separate RFC.
Well, I guess then that begs the question, it's like, what do we do to move forward here? Like, it seems like we should, or at least the TOC is saying, makes sense to hammer out 787 before 705, 707, whatever that was, right? And so
Yep.
either we do 787 or whatever we've been talking about now first.
The simple way to approach this could be to say that selector is not compatible with an inline template for a run. So if you want to use selector, you have to use a cluster run template. Until we solve the broader problem.
I wonder if we need like some higher level architectural plan that accounts for this train and blueprints and, you know, like it seems like a lot of these changes are, some of these changes could happen in the current instance of, you know, current version of Cartographer in a way that's non-breaking, right? And we should do that where possible. if we feel like it's worth delivering that value soon, right? But then a bunch of these changes that are more breaking, we should probably wrap together and say, okay, this is the next API version, or this is going to sit next to kind of the stuff we already did. Maybe having one proposal that kind of accounts for these different things together that are very interconnected would kind of help clarify that. I know, Scott, you've been asking for smaller pieces sometimes too. So I think it's something we have to figure out how to balance.
Big visions, small scopes of change.
I think we're missing that big vision document that it kind of fans out to all the smaller changes.
Okay, great. Any other comment around this RFC? All right. Yeah, well, I guess not enough time left for introducing any additional RFC. So for everyone else out there, keep an eye on the RFC board. There you can have a sense on the actual status of each RFC. And yeah, keep adding to the discussion there. So thank you all for joining. Thanks for your input, your feedback. It was awesome. See you next week.